What happens when Hollywood's most laid-back actor meets a talk show host having the worst night of his career? The answer involves security guards, a heated argument about method acting, and one of the most uncomfortable television moments ever. Captured on live TV, Owen Wilson walked onto that late-night stage, expecting a typical promotional interview for his latest comedy. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a verbal battlefield that would end with him being physically escorted off the set, while cameras kept rolling. Before we dive into this absolutely wild story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think really happened behind the scenes. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one, because what unfolds is unlike anything you've ever seen on late-night television. The trouble started before Owen even sat down. The host had been dealing with plummeting ratings for months, and network executives were breathing down his neck about the show's future. Sources from the studio revealed that he'd been drinking heavily in his dressing room before taping, trying to calm his nerves about a particularly brutal review that had come out that morning, calling his comedy stale and predictable. When Owen walked onto the set with his characteristic easygoing smile, the host saw an opportunity to create some viral content that might save his dying career. The interview began normally enough. Owen settled into the guest chair, adjusted his signature blonde hair, and started talking about his new movie with his usual charm and self-deprecating humor. The audience was eating it up, laughing at his stories about working with his co-stars and the ridiculous situations they found themselves in during filming. But the host wasn't satisfied with the lighthearted banter. He wanted something bigger, something that would get people talking on social media. That's when he made his first mistake. Instead of following the pre-approved questions that had been discussed with Owen's publicist, the host suddenly shifted gears and brought up Owen's personal struggles from years past. The audience grew quiet as the host pressed deeper into topics that were clearly off-limits. Owen's smile faded, and you could see the confusion in his eyes as he tried to redirect the conversation back to his movie. But the host wasn't backing down. He seemed almost desperate as he pushed harder, bringing up family issues and past relationships that had nothing to do with why Owen was there. The normally relaxed actor started shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting with the coffee mug he'd been given. You could feel the tension building in the studio as crew members exchanged worried glances. Even the audience seemed to sense that something was going wrong. Owen tried to handle it with his usual grace, making a few jokes to lighten the mood and steering the conversation towards safer ground. But every time he attempted to bring things back to normal, the host would interrupt him with another invasive question or make a snide comment about his acting abilities. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, and everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something that should never have been happening on live television. The breaking point came when the host made a particularly cruel joke about Owen's nose, something that had been a source of insecurity for the actor since a childhood accident. The audience gasped, and you could see Owen's jaw tighten as he processed what had just been said. For a moment, the studio was completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras that were still rolling, capturing every second of this increasingly uncomfortable exchange. Owen leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a level that was barely audible to the studio audience, but crystal clear to viewers at home. He told the host that he'd crossed a line and that this wasn't what he'd signed up for when he agreed to appear on the show. The host, instead of apologizing or backing down, doubled down on his aggressive approach. He claimed he was just trying to have a real conversation instead of the usual promotional fluff that guests usually delivered. That's when Owen Wilson, the guy known for saying wow in movies and maintaining his cool in every situation, finally lost his temper. He stood up from his chair and told the host exactly what he thought about his interviewing style and his character as a person. The words that came out of Owen's mouth were unlike anything anyone had ever heard from him before. Gone was the laid-back surfer dude persona, replaced by someone who was genuinely angry and not afraid to show it. The host's face turned red as Owen continued his verbal assault, calling out not just the inappropriate questions, but the host's obvious desperation and unprofessional behavior. Owen pointed out that the host was clearly struggling with his own demons and taking it out on his guests, which was both pathetic and cruel. The audience sat in stunned silence as this normally gentle man transformed into someone they'd never seen before. But instead of apologizing or trying to de-escalate the situation, the host made the biggest mistake of his career. He stood up too, getting in Owen's face and telling him that if he couldn't handle a real interview, maybe he should stick to making brain-dead comedies for teenagers. The insult hit Owen like a physical blow, and you could see something snap behind his eyes. This wasn't just about the interview anymore. It was about years of being underestimated and dismissed by people who thought they were better than him. Owen's response was swift and brutal. He called the host a failed comedian who was taking out his frustrations on people who had actually succeeded in the entertainment industry. He pointed out that the show's ratings were in the toilet because audiences could see through the host's fake persona and desperate attempts to stay relevant. Every word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to hit where it would hurt the most. The studio audience didn't know whether to applaud or run for the exits as these two men faced off in what had become the most uncomfortable television moment in recent memory. Camera operators kept filming, even though they probably should have stopped, capturing every second of this career-ending confrontation. You could see panic in the eyes of the show's producers as they realized this was going to be a public relations nightmare that would follow them for years. The host's face was now purple with rage as Owen's words hit their mark. You could see veins bulging in his neck as he processed what the normally calm actor had just said about his career and personal failures. Instead of backing down like any rational person would have done, the host decided to escalate things even further. He started yelling about how Owen was just another privileged Hollywood actor who couldn't handle real questions from real journalists. Owen laughed, but it wasn't his usual warm chuckle. This was cold and sharp, cutting through the tension in the studio like a knife. He told the host that calling himself a journalist was the funniest thing he'd heard all week, considering his idea of hard-hitting journalism was asking about people's personal tragedies for cheap laughs. The audience was completely silent now, some people covering their mouths in shock at what they were witnessing. The host, clearly losing control of both the situation and himself, made another catastrophic error in judgment. He brought up Owen's brother Luke and made a tasteless comment about mental health struggles that had been widely reported in the media years earlier. The moment those words left his mouth, you could feel the entire studio atmosphere change. Even the crew members who had been trying to stay professional looked horrified at what their boss had just said. Owen's expression went completely blank for a few seconds, and everyone in that room knew that something irreversible had just happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that people in the back of the studio had to strain to hear him. He told the host that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his pathetic career, and that there would be consequences for crossing that particular line. The threat wasn't delivered with anger or shouting. It was said with the kind of calm certainty that was somehow more terrifying than any emotional outburst. The host, apparently oblivious to how badly he'd just screwed up, kept pushing. He started making jokes about Owen's family and suggesting that maybe mental health issues ran in the Wilson family. Each word was like gasoline on a fire that was already burning out of control. Owen stood there taking it all in, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with barely contained fury. That's when Owen Wilson did something that nobody in that studio expected. Instead of getting louder or more aggressive, He got eerily calm. He sat back down in his chair, looked directly into the camera, and started speaking to the audience at home. He told them that they were witnessing exactly why this show was failing and why the host's career was circling the drain. He explained that what they'd just seen was a desperate man trying to create controversy at the expense of other people's. Payne, the host, realizing that Owen was effectively taking control of his own show, tried to interrupt and regain command of the situation. But Owen wasn't finished. He continued speaking directly to the camera, ignoring the host completely, and started detailing other incidents where the host had crossed lines with guests. He mentioned specific examples of inappropriate behavior that had been covered up by the network, things that most people didn't know about but that were common knowledge among people in the industry. The host's panic was now visible to everyone in the room. He started frantically signaling to his producers to cut to commercial, but Owen kept talking. He told the audience that they deserved better than watching someone's personal breakdown disguised as entertainment. He said that real comedy and real conversation didn't require tearing people down or exploiting their vulnerabilities for cheap laughs. By this point, the host was practically begging Owen to stop talking, but it was too late. Owen had found his rhythm and wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. He started talking about the culture of late-night television and how hosts had gotten away with inappropriate behavior for too long because nobody ever called them out on it. He was essentially giving a master class in media criticism while sitting on the very show he was dismantling. The host made one final desperate attempt to regain control by trying to physically grab the microphone from Owen's lapel. That turned out to be the worst decision he could have made. Owen stood up and firmly but politely removed the host's hands from his clothing, telling him that putting hands on guests was probably not the best idea given everything else that had already happened during this interview. The audience, which had been silent for most of this confrontation, finally started reacting. Some people were applauding Owen's composure under pressure, while others seemed genuinely concerned about the host's erratic behavior. Camera operators were getting conflicting signals from producers about whether to keep filming or cut away, resulting in awkward shots that captured the chaos behind the scenes as well as in front of the cameras. Owen used this moment of confusion to deliver what would become the most quoted line from this entire incident. He looked directly at the host and said that this was exactly why his show was dying, because audiences could smell desperation and cruelty from a mile away. He pointed out that successful hosts built their careers on making guests feel comfortable and entertaining audiences, not on attacking people who were there to promote their work. The host's response was to start screaming about how Owen was ruining his show and his career. He accused Owen of being ungrateful and unprofessional, apparently forgetting that the entire confrontation had been started by his own inappropriate questions and behavior. Owen just stood there watching this meltdown with what could only be described as professional interest, like he was studying a particularly fascinating but disturbing psychological case study. It was at this point that the show's head producer finally decided enough was enough. He came onto the stage and tried to separate the two men, but the host was having none of it. He pushed his own producer away and continued his rant about how Owen was destroying everything he'd worked for. Owen, meanwhile, calmly straightened his jacket and told the producer that he understood this was an impossible situation, but that the host had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The host, seeing that even his own staff was turning against him, made one last desperate play for sympathy. He started talking about the pressures of late-night television and how difficult it was to keep shows fresh and interesting in an increasingly competitive landscape. But his attempt at garnering sympathy fell flat because everyone had just witnessed his completely unprofessional behavior over the past several minutes. Owen listened to this pathetic display for a moment before responding with devastating effectiveness. He pointed out that every other late-night host managed to do their jobs without attacking their guests personally or making jokes about family tragedies. He suggested that maybe the problem wasn't the competitive landscape, but rather the host's inability to adapt and grow as an entertainer and interviewer. The studio audience, which had been uncomfortable and silent for most of this exchange, started murmuring among themselves. You could hear people discussing what they just witnessed and expressing their opinions about who was in the wrong. Most of the comments that were audible seemed to be supporting Owen's position and criticizing the host's behavior, which only made the host more angry and desperate. The host, hearing the audience's murmurs of disapproval directed at him rather than Owen, completely lost what remained of his composure. He started pointing at random audience members and accusing them of not understanding the pressures of live television. His behavior had become so erratic that several people in the front row actually got up and moved to different seats. Clearly uncomfortable with his increasingly unhinged demeanor, Owen watched this display with what appeared to be genuine concern rather than satisfaction. He approached the host slowly, like someone trying to calm down a dangerous animal, and suggested that maybe they should take a break and continue this conversation off camera. But the host interpreted this gesture as condescension and launched into another tirade about how Owen thought he was better than everyone else just because he'd been in successful movies. That's when the host made his final and most catastrophic mistake. He grabbed Owen by the arm and tried to force him back into the guest chair, apparently thinking he could somehow salvage the interview by physically controlling the situation. Owen, who had maintained his composure through everything else, finally reached his breaking point. He firmly but forcefully removed the host's hand from his arm and told him in no uncertain terms that putting hands on guests was completely unacceptable. The host's response was to accuse Owen of being violent and dramatic, which was particularly ironic considering he was the one who had initiated physical contact. Owen pointed out this obvious contradiction while simultaneously backing away from the host to avoid any further physical confrontation. The contrast between Owen's measured response and the host's continued escalation was stark and obvious to everyone watching. Security personnel, who had been watching this unfold from the wings, finally decided it was time to intervene. But instead of restraining the host, who had been behaving erratically and had initiated physical contact, they approached Owen. This decision would later become another source of controversy, as viewers questioned why the guest who had been defending himself was being treated as the problem, rather than the host who had created the entire situation. Owen, seeing security approaching him, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender and told them he was ready to leave voluntarily. He made it clear that he had no interest in continuing this interview under these circumstances and that he would be happy to go. His cooperation with security stood in sharp contrast to the host's continued ranting and raving, which was still going on even as Owen was being escorted away. But the host wasn't finished. As Owen was walking toward the exit with security guards, the host followed them, still yelling about how Owen had ruined his show and disrespected him in front of his audience. Owen turned around one final time and delivered a parting shot that would be replayed on social media for weeks afterward. He told the host that he hadn't ruined the show. He'd simply revealed what it really was underneath all the fake smiles and manufactured charm. The host's final response was to ban Owen from ever appearing on the show again, as if Owen would have any interest in returning after what had just happened. Owen's reaction was to laugh, his first genuine laugh of the entire evening, and say that being banned from this particular show felt more like a reward than a punishment. The audience, despite the uncomfortable atmosphere, couldn't help but chuckle at this response as Owen reached the exit. He paused and looked back at the audience one more time. He thanked them for their time and apologized that their evening had been disrupted by what he called unprofessional behavior. He told them they deserved better entertainment than what they'd just witnessed and suggested they might want to consider watching shows where the hosts treated their guests with basic human decency. The host, still not ready to let this go, made one final attempt to have the last word. He started talking about how Owen's career was over and how no one would want to work with him after this incident. But his words fell on deaf ears because Owen was already gone, and the audience was clearly not buying what the host was selling. If anything, the host's continued attacks on Owen after he'd already left made him look even worse. The show's producers finally managed to get the host off the stage and cut to an emergency commercial break, but the damage was already done. The entire confrontation had been broadcast live to millions of viewers, and within minutes, clips of the incident were being shared across every social media platform imaginable. The consensus among viewers was overwhelmingly in favor of Owen, with most people praising his restraint and professionalism in the face of completely inappropriate behavior. What made this incident even more damaging for the host was that Owen's reputation in Hollywood had always been that of someone who was incredibly easy to work with and professional in every situation. The fact that he had been pushed to this point spoke volumes about how badly the host had behaved. Industry insiders who had worked with Owen over the years came forward to defend him, sharing stories about his kindness and professionalism on movie sets. The host, meanwhile, found himself in the worst possible position. He had created a public relations disaster that couldn't be spun or explained away because it had all happened on live television. His own network executives were reportedly furious about the incident, not just because of the bad publicity, but because they now had to deal with potential legal issues related to the host's treatment of a guest. Within hours of the incident, the hashtag supporting Owen was trending worldwide, while hashtags critical of the host were also gaining massive traction. Entertainment news shows were already analyzing the footage and interviewing body language experts about what had really happened during those uncomfortable minutes on stage. The consensus was that Owen had shown remarkable restraint while the host had displayed behavior that was completely unacceptable for a professional television host. The irony of the entire situation was that the host had gotten exactly what he wanted: viral content that would get people talking. But instead of saving his career, he had probably ended it. The incident became a case study in how not to conduct an interview, and how quickly things can spiral out of control when professionalism is abandoned in favor of desperation and manufactured controversy. The lasting image from this entire debacle was Owen Wilson, walking calmly toward the exit while maintaining his dignity, contrasted with the host's continued shouting and erratic behavior even after his guest had left the building. It was a perfect metaphor for the difference between someone who understood what professionalism meant and someone who had completely lost sight of it in pursuit of ratings and relevance. This whole incident raises serious questions about the culture of late-night television and whether hosts should be held to higher standards when it comes to treating their guests with basic respect. What do you think should happen to hosts who cross the line like this? Should there be consequences for this kind of behavior, or is it just part of the entertainment business? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the moments when Hollywood's carefully constructed facades come crashing down.